Hello and welcome to Austen Wednesdays. I'm Lizzie Dunford and I'm the director of Jane Austen's house. In this edition, I had joined forces with Sophie, our collections manager, and together we had a really fascinating conversation with Emma Rutherford, who is an art historian and a world expert on portrait miniatures, which are a really important and central part of the visual arts that Jane Austen would have known. And they also form a really interesting and quite intrinsic part of our collection here at Jane Austen's house. Now, we did have a little technical problem with the introduction. The interview itself is safe, but I'm recording this a few days later. So in a moment, you'll notice my outfit change, and this is why. To kick the interview off, I asked Emma to give us an introduction to portrait miniatures and to tell us why they were so important in the Georgian period that Jane Austen inhabited.
So I think the really fascinating thing about portrait miniatures is they give a completely different perspective in terms of life at this date. So Jane Austen is very much part of the Georgian period when portrait miniatures were absolutely at their height. So she's born in the 1770s, and probably portrait miniatures were at their most fashionable, with the most number of artists working around the 1780s. So they would have been objects that she would have been used to having around her. Her parents commissioned portrait miniatures for their own marriage. Her brothers, her aunts, her uncles, everybody's commissioning portrait miniatures. So that they're objects that she's really familiar with. And that then, of course, comes through in her novels when she uses portrait miniatures as a device. And of course, they're also to do with social standing as well. So they play into lots and lots of areas of her personal life, but also in what she's writing about. Do you want me to explain a little bit about what a portrait miniature is?
Yes, please. That would be wonderful. Yes.
So they begin in the 16th century with Henry VIII, and their tradition comes from the tradition of manuscript illumination. So the word portrait miniature doesn't just mean small. The word miniature derives from the word minium, which is the red lead color used in manuscript illumination. So they're really defined by their materials rather than by their size, but because their materials were always watercolor and always watercolor on vellum, and then from the mid 18th century, well, sort of early to mid 18th century on ivory, they're kept confined by the material on which they were painted. But they're also, their purpose defined their size because they're very private images. And I think the best way to think about them in a contemporary context is to think about the image that's on your mobile phone. So this is a portable image. It's something you want to look at on a very frequent basis, even if it's an image of your dog. And it's and it's got an intimacy, and you've got a control over it as well, because people can't just pick up your mobile phone and access that image. So portrait miniatures sort of functioned in a very, very similar way. You chose who looked at them if you were the owner. And they're wonderfully intimate things. So when they're first commissioned, really only 3 sets of eyes initially are meant to look at them. So the person who commissions the miniature, the artist who's painting it, and then the person who receives the miniature. So if you think about that beginning for them, and then now, of course, we're able to look at them whenever we like, but initially they're really only seen by a very, very small circle. So compared to the large oil portrait that you have on your wall, which is for public display, they have such a different purpose to that. So that's a bit of a background to a portrait miniature.
Absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. So they're these very intimate objects. To what extent are they markers of wealth? Are these luxury objects? Is it very much the top end, or are they filtering through into society?
Well, I think Jane Austen is around at a really interesting time for miniatures, because they do start to become more democratic objects. So when Henry VIII introduces them to the court in the 1520s, it's very, very much confined to the court and courtly circles. But by the time Austen is used to seeing miniatures every day, they are, almost anybody could have their portrait painted in a miniature, but of course it then depended which artist you went to. So in the Austen collection, you've got that wonderful little miniature by John Smart of Philadelphia Hancock, which was commissioned in the 1770s. And John Smart would have been one of the most expensive artists she could have sat to. So she's gone right to the top there. But
right
then
to the top.
Right to the top. But then the Digweed family, which I think you've acquired fairly recently, they're painted by an artist who I think somebody described as cold calling. They would itinerant, they would travel around, work as quickly as they possibly could. They're very inexpensively framed, whereas Philadelphia Hancock's is in this lovely diamond mount. And so yeah, they can. There's a huge range of artists and a huge range of prices.
That's absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. We've talked a little bit about the objects in our collection and also in Jane Austen's novels. We have Sophie. How many miniatures have we got in our collection? Sophie, our collections and interpretation manager. Talk a bit more about what we have.
Goodness. So to prepare for this interview with Emma, we sent Emma a huge list of all the miniatures in the collection, and they kind of span from, as you were saying, the Digweed portraits, which are kind of cheap and cheerful, and they were sort of churned out quickly by I suppose that's sort of the equivalent of a sort of cartoonist or someone on the side of the street who quickly throws together a portrait for you in 5 minutes for a tenner or something like that, through to this really beautiful portrait miniature of Philadelphia Hancock, which is all set in diamonds and is absolutely exquisite. And in between that, I mean, I'm not quite sure how many in terms of numbers. We probably have about 20 or 25, 30. And there, Philadelphia Hancock is right at the top of the scale. We don't have many that are quite as gorgeous as that. But we have sort of a whole range. And something that's really interesting about our collection, I think, is that whether or not an object is sort of artistically interesting or valuable, precious, isn't really the reason that it would have come into our collection. So our collection of miniatures really relate to the sitter and whether it's somebody that was of interest to Jane Austen. And in general, Jane Austen isn't moving in the sorts of circles that can afford to have, really brilliant painters come and paint their likenesses. So we're really lucky that Philadelphia Hancock was in that sort of higher sphere, and we managed to it means that the collection is all the richer for having a sort of handful of objects which are really sort of artistically really interesting as well as their subject matter. And I suppose that's just because Philadelphia's life was so very different to Jane Austen's. She was in India, she was living in quite different circles, and her husband was very wealthy and was able to commission that sort of piece for her.
Yeah, I think one of your really fascinating objects is the William Wood miniature of Mary Pearson, which is a really recent acquisition that we worked on together. And I think in terms of sort of social standing, it's a really fascinating object, because Mary Pearson, who was engaged to Henry Austen, to Jane's brother, has had her portrait miniature commissioned by William Wood, who also paints her sister. And her father is the governor of Greenwich Hospital, so he's very high up in the Navy, whereas Henry's relatively low down in the militia. And but I think there's an idea that Henry's perhaps looking at Mary Pearson to improve his standing in society, and certainly to improve his lot financially, because she would have come with a pretty decent dowry, whereas a lot of Austen is about women trying to find men to do the opposite for them, or do the same for them. But William Wood would have also been a very expensive person to go to have your portrait miniature painted. So it's a very good reflection of where Henry is aiming, that the miniature you own of Mary Pearson is by this very good artist. In fact, I've got a miniature here. That's a male sitter by William Wood, and you can just see the quality and I'm sure you'll show your audience an image of your Mary Pearson, but I mean, he's a superb miniaturist, William Wood.
And I mean, I'm under the impression that artists that specialised in miniatures sort of particularly specialised in that. That was a particular skill that they focused on. And it would William Wood, for example, would he pretty much just paint miniatures? Was that his niche?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, the top miniaturists, there are normally a few oils by them as well, because miniature painting in the 18th century was still thought to be on a lower rung than oil painting. I mean, portraiture in general wasn't as grand as history painting. So it had people knew that you took on commissions for portraits to make money, and it wasn't that your soul was demanding that you had to express yourself in a certain way. So yeah, but the best miniaturists like Smart and Wood are almost wholly devoted to painting miniatures.
I mean, this is a bit of a mean question, but is it possible to equate that to today's values? I mean, how much would a William Wood miniature, the equivalent, how much would you pay for that today? I mean, I don't mean buying one. I mean, if you were commissioning William Wood today in Regency prices, what sort of value are we talking?
Well, funnily enough, I'm working on a Tudor exhibition at the moment, so my mind, this is a really welcome relief from all the beheadings that I'm looking at, is to go into Jane Austen's world. But I mean, I was looking at Tudor miniatures and the cost of them, but I think they were much more expensive then. But they were, one portrait miniature in the 16th century cost the same as a labourer's wages over a 3-year period. They were unbelievably expensive, and really confined to highest echelons in society. But I think by this stage, you would have to be pretty wealthy to commission one. I don't have any exact comparisons, but they weren't something that you just walked in and commissioned, whereas something like silhouettes, which were part of Austen's world as well, if you were staying in Bath, as the Austens were for a period of time, and renting a house and enjoying the pleasures of a city like Bath, silhouettists and miniaturists were set up in every shop in the city, and they worked incredibly long hours, and depending on where you went, I mean, a silhouette could take a few minutes and would probably cost the same almost as having your passport photo taken today. So they were really, really inexpensive, whereas the miniature, you're looking at many times that.
There's a real luster as well to these miniatures. They're so deep, and there's such a depth of field in the colour. Is that, I mean, essentially, how are they made? Because it's not oil on canvas, is it? They are style to them, don't they?
Yeah, so miniatures of the 18th century and early 19th century are painted on these little discs of ivory, and in fact, Austen herself gives an idea of how difficult they were to paint. And I guess if you think about trying to get watercolor to sit on a surface like ivory, which has natural oils in it, it was a very, very difficult thing to accomplish technically, and you can sense Austen's frustration in this, as she attempts it herself and says, she's working on this very small area of ivory, and it's not really giving her much back in terms of progress. But yeah, the ivory, we're not quite sure why ivory was used as a support for the watercolor, because it technically, as I say, it's a very odd thing to choose. And the ivory had to be prepared. It was sort of ironed between bits of greaseproof paper to get some of the grease out of it. And it was rubbed with an animal tooth to give it tiny little pocks, so that the paint would sort of sit in these minuscule little rough bits on the ivory. But miniaturists also sort of floated the paint on, and then they used the colour of the ivory to give that lovely luminosity that we associate with portrait miniatures. So the best miniaturists, these miniatures glow from within. They're really extraordinary works of art, and of course the detail is often quite astonishing. So John Smart, literally, you don't really want to sit to John Smart over the age of 40. He took every single line and crease and mark and eyelash, and it's all there. But I've got a John Smart here. I'm just going to show you the sort of scale that we're talking. So this is a John Smart from the 1770s, and it's about the size of a sort of wristwatch. So, but I think if you put up the image of your lovely Philadelphia, people should be able to see how much detail he managed to get on this tiny little bit of ivory.
Yeah, absolutely. And our Philadelphia portrait, I think, is sort of half the size of that. It was actually worn as a ring, which is sort of unbelievable.
It's more that sort of
exactly
size.
that. Yeah. And is that, I mean, my question next was really about how they were used, because I noticed to begin with they were held sort of on the body, they were very personal and private, but by the Regency, are they more sort of for public display? Were people wearing them more openly to be seen?
They sort of come in a variety of settings depending on their purpose. So you've got a miniature in the collection of Elizabeth Knight, who I think married one of Jane's brothers.
Married Edward, right? the rich brother. Yes.
Yes. And you've got a lovely miniature of her which is set in a patch box. So I've got a patch box here, an ivory patch box, and you can see when you open it, this has got a modern mirror in, but that's exactly what you would have seen. And so that's quite a practical object to set a portrait into. So that's again like your smartphone, you know, it's an object you carry around with you, and that was quite a male thing to carry around with you. And you would also be able to disguise miniatures and things that looked like a pocket watch. So can you see the top there is just like a Georgian pocket watch, but then when you open it up, you've got some miniatures of children. So a man would have worn this on his waistcoat, and you wouldn't have known that there was necessarily miniatures inside. It might have been a watch. But miniatures were also worn like Philadelphia's as a ring, or this one, for example, you would have worn on your wrist. So it's even got little holes at the top and the bottom where you would have threaded through ribbon and worn it and looked at it every day. So they come in a real variety of settings. The other really fun thing about miniatures is because they're quite intimate objects and they're usually commissioned when people became engaged to be married. The lovely miniature of Elizabeth Knight, she's got powdered hair, which was very fashionable. I think it's probably painted around the time of her marriage, around 1790, 91. And because you weren't allowed to be alone with your intended, you didn't necessarily know what colour their hair was under the powder. Hers just looks grey. So I've got a miniature here of a lady with powdered hair, but then which probably, given her age, would have been commissioned for her betrothal. And then on the back, you've got some hair. I don't know if you can see that. And this would have given her husband to be an idea of her natural hair colour, which he might not have discovered until they were married, because that's the only time the powder would have gone and he would have seen her au naturel. They contain all sorts of things, even though they're so small. There's so much information there that was necessary in courtship.
That's so brilliant, and it's so personal, isn't it? I mean, that to me is just sort of screaming of that little bit in Sense and Sensibility where Willoughby cuts off a lock of Marianne's hair, and everyone thinks, well, they must be engaged because he's got a lock of her hair. And you sort of think, if that really, I mean, that makes so much sense that would tie into perhaps you would have their miniature and perhaps there would be a lock of hair in it. Yes. And it's sort of giving secrets of your body away in a way.
Absolutely. I did have one with a lock of hair that was very sort of casually thrown in the back, but that's just a lock of hair that's just been tied with a ribbon and not sort of plaited, or there's nothing really fancy. And again, the gentleman's got powdered hair, so this one would have been for a lady. And yeah, they're very exciting things, and I think it's hugely frustrating there's not a miniature of Jane, of course, because that would be incredible. But miniatures were commissioned generally when people were betrothed, and because she was never properly engaged, I think I'm right in saying that there wouldn't have been an occasion for her family to have commissioned her miniature. Whereas we know the miniature of Mary Pearson, although it wasn't necessarily the miniature that Henry commissioned or owned when he was betrothed to her, we know that Jane comments on the miniature that he did have of her. So they'd got as far as exchanging miniatures. And she's not particularly kind about her possible future sister-in-law. I think, yes, she writes to Cassandra and says, if Miss Pearson should return with me, because she's staying with the Pearsons and her brother, pray be careful not to expect too much beauty, and beauty's got a capital B. I will not pretend to say on first view she quite answers the opinion I had formed of her. My mother, I am sure, will be disappointed. From what I remember of her picture, it is of no great resemblance. So she's clearly suggesting, and I think picture here, authors or people writing on Austen have assumed is a miniature, because it's exactly the sort of picture that portrait would have been commissioned at this stage. So the Austen family have all gathered around and looked at this image and thought, yes, she looks jolly nice. And then Jane's met her and said, well, yeah, you're going to be disappointed when you see her in real life.
That was a question I wanted to ask you, actually, when you were saying about the painter capturing all the lines and things like that. How much of these are these flattering images versus realistic images? We can see that Mary Pearson looks like it's quite not as potential.
Well, in Jane's opinion, yeah.
Or Jane seeing what was within or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
How much were they designed to be relics for someone? So they're, in some words, they're important mementos of the real person, versus how much are they idealized objects?
I think it's hard to know, because at this date photography hasn't been invented, so we've got nothing to compare these images to in terms of something more close to the truth. But I think with miniatures, because they're usually of somebody who you know really well, they tend to be more realistic and less flattering than an oil portrait, which is painted for posterity. The other thing you get in miniatures is people wear very, very up-to-date fashion that you don't then find in their oil portraits, because they're much more ephemeral portrait miniatures. They mark a moment in time, just like photography. So my little smart here of a man, he's got pink hair, and if you can see, he's got pink powder on his hair. There are no oil portraits of anybody with pink powdered hair, but we know from advertisements that you could buy hair powder in all sorts of colours, blue and yellow and pink. So we know people wore their hair with this powder, but it was obviously thought to be a fashion that was going to be out in a certain number of years. So he's had his miniature painted with his very, very trendy pink hair, but he's not going to put that in an oil portrait that his ancestors might hang on to for the next 100 years, because it's just a moment in time. So that also makes miniatures incredibly exciting. But I should think miniaturists were in the habit of flattering their sitters, but I doubt they produced something that made the person totally unrecognizable to the person who was receiving the miniature. And in fact, Jane herself makes this point when she uses miniatures in her novels. The characters often comment, oh, it's very like, or it's not very like. And you'll find with the miniatures, they recognize the person immediately and say, this is very like. Whereas some of the oil paintings, it's often not very like the person that they're representing. And you can, then you sense that people understood there was more theatre and smoke and mirrors in the oil portraits, whereas the miniatures were meant to be much more truthful. So once again, shame there's no miniature of Jane.
I suppose the ideal thing is when a number of miniatures survive of one person, and then you can sort of compare between.
Yeah.
So we just need to find that other lost miniature of Mary Pearson, and then we can cross-reference.
I know. Well, this one in the at Chawton is only a couple of years after the engagement, so I should think it's something she had, some that she probably didn't look very, very different. And I think what's so exciting about that miniature is that Mary Pearson pops up in all the biographies of Jane, you know, and she's possibly the inspiration for Lydia. And she does fall in love with a lovely red man in a red coat. So it's giving a face to somebody who we didn't know what they'd looked like before, but they were part of Jane's world. Someone Jane met, someone Jane commented on their appearance. And Henry's future wife, Eliza, is very nasty about her indeed.
She is,
yeah.
But then she has reason to be, doesn't she?
Does,
She's
yeah.
just about to marry him herself.
Exactly. So it's just fantastic to have an image of an actual picture of somebody who Janeites will know the name of.
And even if I mean, Mary is a part of Jane Austen's story and perhaps helped her to create Lydia, but for me, even if she had nothing to do with Lydia, Mary Pearson just looks like a Jane Austen heroine. I mean, she kind of does help to bring the whole world of Jane Austen's novels to life for us, and it's something to do with dress, I suppose, and hairstyle, and actually that was something else that I wanted to ask you. But when you when you begin sleuthing, when you find a miniature and you want to begin finding out more about it, I mean, where do you start? I imagine it is to do with those things, the dress and the look, the style, things like that.
I mean, the Mary Pearson is such a lovely story for me personally, because we bought this miniature. You know, I work at a commercial gallery, Philip Moore Gallery in London, and we bought this miniature on the quality of it, and I knew who the artist was, and I knew collectors would think it was a fabulous example of a very pretty girl in as you say, and looking very Austen, looking very BBC Austen, you know, absolutely quintessential as you say. So, but it was housed in a very big Victorian gilded frame, and had obviously been on a wall, and had lost its context as a locket. So it's about this size, but it was housed in a much larger frame. And when we took the frame apart, it had all this writing on the back. So you can see how difficult it is to put any information on an object like this. A label is going to disintegrate. There's nowhere to write anything. So many miniatures lose their identity. I mean, the number of unknown man, unknown lady is, you know, outnumbers the known sitters by so many. So yes, we had this information about who she was, which was just fantastic. And she was still in her original gold locket frame within all this later paraphernalia. But of course, the name Mary Pearson didn't mean anything to me at all. Luckily, her father was also mentioned, which I guess is rather typical of the period. And in researching her, I found this incredible connection. But I mean, that was a dream. That was quite easy. But most of them, there are very, very few sitters lists. Luckily, William Wood, who painted the Mary Pearson, his book of sitters is listed is kept rather in the National Art Library at the V&A. So we've accessed that as well, and we found his entry from when Mary sat to him, and her sister as well. So we've got all sorts of information about that, but a lot of miniaturists like is it Jackson, who painted the Digweed family, you know, there's no trace really of who he was or where he lived or what he did, or it's a very, very different story. And I think miniatures they were things which really were of the moment, and they usually marked a moment or an event that was momentous in somebody's life. So they tend to sort of, people move on from miniatures. It's a little bit like when you look through a photo album with your grandmother, and she says, "Oh, that's great Aunt Mabel, and that's, you know, great Uncle Dick," whatever, and nobody writes these things down, and then, you know, a few generations later, the information is just lost. And it's exactly the same with miniatures. So, but the miniature of Francis, Jane's other brother, that you have in naval uniform. So that's another reason why miniatures were commissioned when families were going to be apart for a long time. And he certainly, yeah, was away for years at a time. So he's not married in that miniature. I think that's from the mid 1790s. So this was probably a miniature owned by his parents, by his family. And you can imagine Jane and brothers and Cassandra looking at this miniature as a reminder of what Francis looked like. And he's in his naval uniform, and so you get lots and lots of people in naval and military uniform, and those miniatures are commissioned because they're going to be away from home for a long time. So that's another reason why you would commission. But it's again another nice part of the story.
So I have a question for you. That's just made me think. In Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth goes to Pemberley and they see a collection of miniatures, and Wickham is one of the miniatures there. And I'm just thinking, why would they have a miniature of Wickham? Is that just to drive the plot forward? Or would there be any other acceptable reasons for a family to, would it be perhaps something that you just did of a sort of coming of age present for a man or something like that?
Well, I guess again, it's a sort of social status thing. And if you were rich enough, you could commission miniatures all the time. And as I say, if you were going to places for the season, then it was something that was quite fun to do, and you could just go and gossip. And miniaturists often had almost like a sort of celebrity gallery in their studios, so you could go and see who else had been painted, and you'd hope to catch maybe a glimpse of a couple of people who were having an affair with each other who'd commissioned miniatures, and the latest actress or whatever. So it was sort of if you were rich enough, you could do that. And of course, watercolor dries immediately, so it's not like having an oil painting done, which takes months to dry properly and then has to be framed, and it's a big palaver. Miniatures, there was normally an arrangement with a jeweler, and everything could be assembled really quite quickly. So someone like Wickham, you know, that he might have had dozens of miniatures commissioned, especially if he's terribly good looking.
Yes, to record that whilst it lasts.
Someone like Wellington, who was, you know, big ladies man. I mean, so many miniatures of Wellington have come down through families totally unrelated to Wellington, but he's literally just handing these miniatures out to women who've got a crush on him. And yeah, that's also another reason to have miniatures.
So another question, sorry Lizzie, I'm monopolizing this hugely, but I've just had another sort of query about this, about sort of the etiquette of miniatures. But in Persuasion, so we have Captain Benwick, who's engaged, and then his fiancée dies, and he's had a miniature painted for her, and then he resets it for his next fiancée. And is that acceptable, or is that really a bit, I mean, it sort of doesn't seem very nice, but maybe he doesn't have much money, maybe it would just be too much to have another one painted.
Yeah, I think that's likely, but I think the sort of the pathos of that wouldn't have been lost on her audience, and isn't lost now that you know, he's moving on, and it's a sort of reusing for somebody else, and the idea of looking onto a miniature. I mean, you've seen me hold a miniature. To have a relationship with a miniature, you're looking into somebody's eyes at a sort of distance that's really quite intimate, and you can't have lots and lots of people looking at the same thing at once. So the whole experience of holding and looking at a miniature and then feeling something about that, the person in that miniature, all of that would have been very familiar territory to Austen's initial audience, and they would have understood that somebody else had looked at, or was intended to look at this miniature and be stirred by all these feelings of love and passion, and holding it close and perhaps wearing it close. Miniatures were often worn right next to the body, tucked down bodices, really part of you and a secret part of you. So all of that, I think, is wrapped up in it. But there's something very callous, of course, and mercenary about repackaging and reusing this very intimate portrait, and it's done very, very well as a device, and yeah, would have been very well understood what that meant. And of course, when engagements ended, I think Jane herself with Mary Pearson had to go and was responsible for sort of collecting all the ephemera of their betrothal, and getting everything back and redistributed to the right person. So yeah, very sad thing to have to do often, and miniatures were a casualty of many broken betrothals, I'm sure.
There's a question I wanted to ask about etiquette with that as well. Would you commission your portrait to be given to somebody else, or would you be commissioned sort of as a woman, would you be commissioning your own portrait to give somebody else? I know that Wellington gave his, but would he be expected to be commissioning the woman's in return, or would she be giving her? Is there an element of proprietary and etiquette about that?
I don't think we know too much about that, but I think as most marriageable women, it would have been the parents who would have commissioned the portrait, and the miniature would have been expected to have been used, probably only to have given out at a very serious point in the relationship. So I think we know that Austen's parents exchanged miniatures at the point of their betrothal, but I don't think they would. I think as a woman you wouldn't necessarily have gone out and commissioned your own portrait.
No, it does feel a bit wrong, doesn't it?
It does feel a bit wrong. But interestingly, the portrait of Elizabeth Knight in your collection is painted by a woman. It's painted by a female artist called Anne Mee, and I think I asked Sophie if you had that information or not.
We don't have much information about it at all, actually. So we're really excited to hear everything.
Painted it. So there was miniature painting was something that interestingly was done by many female artists, and there's all sorts of reasons for this. It was quite an easy way to make money. If you were good at portrait painting, you could churn them out relatively quickly. But there's also something in the physicality of painting miniatures. So to paint a miniature, you had to be very, very neat and tidy. You can't even really work somewhere with a lot of soot around that's going to sit on the painting, and there's, if you paint a big oil, you have to be quite physical. You've got your brush and your palette, and you're moving around a lot. There's something much more delicate about being able to just put a little bit of ivory on a slope and paint with these brushes that were squirrel hair, tiny brushes, and your paints would have been kept in mussel shells. Everything's quite delicate and small. So it was sort of considered appropriate for women artists to be professional miniaturists. And the portrait of Elizabeth Knight is painted by a female miniaturist called Anne Mee, who did incredibly well. I mean, she started painting miniatures. I think her mother died when she was very young. She had a very, very big family of brothers and sisters, and she was clearly very talented and was sort of sent out to work, as it were. And she did eventually marry, and her husband was much stricter than her father had been, and she was only allowed to paint female sitters after her marriage. And there's all sorts of rumours about him sort of finding out she'd been painting men and cutting off all her hair, and anyway. But her self-portrait, which is in the V&A, is painted at almost exactly the same time that she paints Elizabeth Knight. So they're a really lovely comparison, and she's also got powdered hair, and she's wearing a white sort of ribbon in her hair, like a bandeau, and a white dress. So they're quite similar portraits. But I often wonder for female sitters whether they would have been that bit more comfortable sitting to a female miniaturist, because you have to get quite close, and obviously you've got to have some sort of patter conversation, otherwise your subject's going to fall asleep. So it's really fascinating that she's chosen, or her family have chosen, a female miniaturist to paint her for what was probably her engagement portrait. So yeah, that's a rather nice aspect of miniature painting, that there's so many female miniaturists.
Very much so.
Perhaps your fiance would be more comfortable with that too, knowing that
Yes,
you weren't being
good
closeted
point.
with another man.
Yeah, very good point. There's some very lewd cartoons showing male miniaturists painting females, and peering in very close with an eyeglass to try, obviously, look at every line, but yes, rather crossing the boundary, I think.
Would the sitter be going to the studio, or would the artist come to the house? Or again, would it depend on social standing? And
It's so that the very best miniaturists, Richard Cosway, John Smart, George Engelhart, and even Anne Mee, had their own studios, and you would go there, and then you would have places where, as I said, miniaturists would set themselves up above shops that sold things like buckles and sort of knickknacks and jewellery, that sort of thing, for the season. Because painting miniatures was such a sort of quick turnover that you couldn't really stay in one town. You might be okay in a city where people were visiting, but the Digweeds, painted by Jackson, we know that he travelled around the country, and the sort of very lowest rung would have been almost like a sort of country fair, where you would have had a lot of silhouettists and possibly miniature painters there as well, and that would have been a very inexpensive way to get your miniature painted. But yeah, for the better miniaturists, you would have to go to their studio, and that would have been a very pleasant experience, and they had offered very good conversation and food, and often music. And as I say, you also got a glimpse of who'd been in lately, because they would often do a second version or a sketch of some of the better known celebrities who might have had their miniature
gallery wall.
Exactly. Yeah.
I really want to replicate this at the house somehow. So this just sounds so amazing to go into the miniaturist studio. Though you're so about it with the pigment in mussel shells. I can just imagine stepping into this space. It's just such a different era, but yet so evocative of that very basic human behavior of wanting to have those we love close and an image of them. It's fascinating to see it. So what we think is quite a modern phenomenon is actually not by any stretch of the imagination, and that sort of portable devotion for want to actually, to some extent. It's fascinating.
And the love of fashion, and I mean, people talk about selfies, and it's not a new concept. It's all it was all there in miniatures, and just the fast turnover as well, and how you wanted to be seen. As you know, I guess when most people were betrothed, they were very young, late teens, early 20s at the oldest. So they're really, they're vivacious, they're fascinated by dancing and fashion, and exactly the same as today's teenagers posting on Instagram, their selfies, and why are they doing that? Well, need to ask Austen.
Nothing changes.
No, exactly.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about was what happens to them afterwards. You're saying about Mary Pearson's being mounted in a Victorian frame, but and being returned. They're returned when things don't go well. What happens when they go right? What's the very much of this moment, this zeitgeist, this marriage market time? What happens to them next through cultural history?
Well, we know when Queen Charlotte married George III, or when Charlotte married George III, she's painted wearing a miniature on her wrist by an artist called Jeremiah Meyer. I've got an example by him here, who I think is an artist who painted portraits of the Austen family. I've seen his name associated with the Austen family. So she's painted in her big oil painting with a miniature like that on her wrist of George III. So obviously they're both relatively young, but even as an old lady, in that wonderful portrait of her by Lawrence in the National Gallery, she's still wearing the same portrait of her husband as a young man. So some miniatures were worn by their owners well after the sitter looked in their first flush of youth. And I think reading about the Philadelphia Hancock miniature at Chawton by John Smart, that's mentioned in a will, and it's very specifically said, that her daughter must hang on to it, and then it goes through some generations. So they're very much kept within the family, and I guess unfortunately, like anything, families die out, or possessions get scattered, and identifications get lost. So they can scatter to the four winds, or you can be lucky enough, like the Philadelphia Hancock, to know exactly what you have, because it's been kept within the family for such a long time. So so they're ephemeral on one hand, but on the other hand, they can provide some longevity as well.
Emma, thank you so much. That's been a sort of tour de force of everything. In fact, I do actually have one more question. This isn't Austen at all, but the portrait miniature story that I think is the most fascinating is when they become just body parts. I've read about miniatures that are just an eye or something like that. And tell us what on earth those are about.
I love that, body parts.
Nothing inappropriate. Just
no. Well, you say that. I have seen some inappropriate ones. Yes. So the main fashion is for eye miniatures, which comes in towards the end of the 18th century. And the idea is that you literally just have the eye of your loved one painted. And it's sort of it was very, very fashionable for George, Prince Regent, he started off really with a eye miniature of Mrs. Fitzherbert. And I think this plays into the sort of intimate side of portrait miniatures. So if you've got just somebody's eye, it's quite likely that only you know whose eye you possess. And I think there was a bit of a sort of guessing game with people wearing an eye of their lover, not necessarily their husband or wife, and who's with who, and whose eye is that they're wearing. But there's also all sorts of, I'm sure, other reasons, like the eye being the window to the soul, and this being just part of the body that you're looking in. You can gaze into somebody's eye if you're in love with them, that sort of thing. But now they look very odd, disassociated from the rest of the face. But in the Georgian later Georgian period, they're very, very fashionable and commissioned by lots of people. You sometimes get a little pearl for a tear embedded onto the ivory as well. They're quite imaginative. But in an American museum, a female miniaturist actually painted a miniature of just her chest, which is pretty strange, and sent that to her lover, who was a married man actually, in the early 19th century. So that's quite interesting. But I think it really plays into how these miniatures were something that once you owned the miniature, it was absolutely up to you who saw it, because you didn't have to show it to anybody if you didn't want to. So there's a lovely control there, and it can be something that just you look at, and even if the person is physically absent, you can still have a relationship with this thing you can hold in your hand. You can still look into those eyes even if that person isn't there, and I think feel that love that you perhaps felt while they're around. But it's the eye miniatures are something quite extraordinary.
I have another question as well.
Okay.
Does this
Great.
then is there also then a connection afterwards with sort of the Victorian mourning jewelry? Does that come out of this?
Yes, very much so. So a lot of miniatures are mounted in mourning style casing after the person's died. So they're a very, very big part of mourning, understandably. Before photography, this is your memory of what somebody looked like, and you often get engraved, if you're lucky enough, the name of the person and their death date there. And it's particularly obviously poignant when it's a child, and you sometimes get children painted in miniatures in clouds, which is often a deceased child, and people like Richard Cosway, who were working in the 18th century. I've sold miniatures of children where he's been called to the house after death to record what the child looked like, to be set into a miniature to obviously be kept and used as part of the grieving process. So they're a big part of that. But I haven't really talked about that with Jane because Jane Austen, because I don't think there's anything in the collection that really relates to mourning jewelry. It's all happy stuff.
It is. Let other pens dwell on misery.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you. No idea they had that long a history going back to Henry VIII. Their origins is just
Well, I think that's why, as a historian, I find them so exciting, because because they were handheld, you've got that sort of that physicality there. I mean, I think I very first encountered a portrait miniature at Hever Castle when I was about 9 or 10 years old, of Anne Boleyn, and I've got no idea now whether it, what it was, but I think at the time the idea that Henry VIII had held this object and looked at it and felt love, or passion, or God knows whatever he did feel about Anne, mainly passion. I just found that so exciting, and it was so different, the idea of him just having a one-to-one experience rather than the kind of pomp and ceremony of an oil painting that lots of people can stand around and talk about. And it's just such a wonderful insight, I think, into people's lives. So when you get somebody like Jane Austen, where there isn't much, sadly, there's not tons of things that relate to her personally. I think any miniatures that surround her are such a lovely insight into her personal life and people around her. So I think that makes them particularly exciting.
Well, Emma, thank you so much for being with us today. That has been a truly fascinating talk that has almost literally illuminated so much about Jane Austen's world and the world around her in their visual arts. And thank you so much for being with us today.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Now, I could have talked to Emma all day about that subject. It was just so fascinating, and it's really informed my understanding of our collection and the context of the art that was produced at the time. I just love the idea of it being held close to the body, the personality and the real emotion that came from those miniatures. Now, if you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and also have a look back at our other Austen Wednesdays. They're on a whole range of brilliant topics, from rereading Austen to Jane Austen and food and the theatre and costume. And we've also got all sorts of fantastic other clips on there. Don't miss the Darcy project. So keep tuned to our YouTube channel and wait to see you at the next Austen Wednesdays.